My name is Riley Taylor. I am 32 years old. 2 months ago, my parents skipped my wedding to attend a cocktail party. 4 weeks before I was supposed to walk down the aisle in Texas, my parents called to tell me they could not afford the $200 flights from Florida. They told me my father's fixed pension was stretched too thin and his sciatica was acting up. I told them I understood. I filed the rejection away and kept planning my life. But on the afternoon of my wedding, while I was sitting in my bridal suite smelling hairspray and white lilies, my maid of honor walked into the room. She did not say a word. She just handed me her phone. It was an Instagram live stream. My mother, wearing a custom navy evening gown, was leaning into the frame to kiss my older sister Morgan on the cheek. They were standing on the polished teak deck of a luxury yacht in Puget Sound, 3,000 miles and 2 time zones away. The Seattle skyline sat in the background. My father leaned in next, raising a crystal flute of champagne toward the camera, shouting his congratulations over the music. Morgan had just received a corporate promotion. My parents miraculously cured my father's back pain and found the cash for first-class tickets, a penthouse rental, and designer clothes to celebrate her new title. That is all it took for them to abandon my wedding day. They left an entire front row of mahogany chairs empty at my ceremony. But here is the part that makes this story worth telling. 60 days later, I was sitting on the terrace of a rented villa in Costa Rica for my honeymoon. I turned on my phone for the first time in a week. It vibrated against the glass table for 3 unbroken minutes. Notifications stacked in a frantic cascade. 84 missed calls, 100 text messages, 315 voicemails. The caller IDs read like a roster of people I had already buried in my mind. My father, my mother, aunts and cousins. They did not call to apologize. They called because the bank was foreclosing on the home my father built. They called because my sister was facing federal indictments for wire fraud. They called because their entire financial existence had collapsed overnight, and they needed me, the forensic accountant they threw away, to rescue them. Instead of saving them, I handed the federal government the exact documents needed to lock them out of their accounts and send my sister to a federal penitentiary. Before I explain how a single corporate compliance audit destroyed my family, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you all are listening from. Now let me take you back to a Thanksgiving dinner in Tampa, the night I first realized my sister's mistakes would always be my burden. To understand how my parents could so easily trade my wedding day for a cocktail party on a yacht, you have to understand the family ledger. In the Taylor household, loyalty was not unconditional. It was accounted for, tracked, and always balanced against the needs of my older sister. Morgan was the golden child. I was the contingency plan. The first time I truly understood this dynamic, I was 25. It was Thanksgiving 2019, and we were sitting in the living room of my parents' house in Tampa. My mother had spent 3 days preparing the meal, filling the house with the smell of roasted turkey and sage stuffing. Morgan arrived late, carrying a designer handbag she had purchased during a recent trip to Europe. After dinner, while my father poured coffee, Morgan sat on the edge of the velvet sofa and started crying. They were not the heavy, jagged tears of real panic. They were the practiced, delicate tears of someone who knew exactly how to perform an apology. She confessed that she had accidentally spent her $15,000 graduate school tuition. She had not lost it. She had not been robbed. She had used the money to fund a 6-week vacation across Italy and France. She talked about the Amalfi Coast and Parisian cafes while dabbing her eyes with a linen napkin. She said she lost track of the spending. She said the currency exchange rates confused her. My mother did not yell. My father did not demand an explanation or tell her she needed to drop out and get a job. Instead, the room went entirely quiet, and then my mother turned her head to look directly at me. "Riley," my mother said, her voice smooth and reasonable. "You have a very good credit score. If you co-sign a private student loan for Morgan, the interest rate will be manageable. We can figure out a payment plan later." She did not ask if I had the financial stability to take on $15,000 of high-interest debt. She did not ask if I was comfortable tying my credit to a sister who had just funded a European vacation with tuition money. She simply presented it as my familial obligation. I was the responsible daughter. Therefore, it was my job to absorb the consequences of Morgan's recklessness. I looked at my mother, then at my father, who was staring at his coffee cup, avoiding eye contact. Then I looked at Morgan, who had stopped crying and was waiting for me to say yes. "I am not doing that," I said. The silence that followed was heavy and cold. It was the kind of silence that tells you the rules of the house have just been broken. "Family helps family," my father muttered, finally looking up. "A loan is not help, Dad," I replied. "It is a legal contract, and I am not signing one so Morgan can go to graduate school after she chose to go to Paris." They did not speak to me for the rest of the evening. When I left the next morning to drive back to Texas, my mother gave me a stiff, obligatory hug. They did not call me again until Christmas. That Thanksgiving set the precedent for the next decade of our lives. I moved to Austin and built a career as a forensic accountant for a major corporate risk assessment firm. My job was to dig into corporate mergers, find the hidden liabilities, and expose the lies people tell with numbers. I worked 60-hour weeks, paid off my own modest student loans, and bought my first car with cash. Because I was self-sufficient, my parents decided I needed nothing. Because I did not ask for money, they assumed I did not need support. Every spare dollar in their Florida retirement accounts went to Morgan's emergencies. When her car broke down because she refused to pay for oil changes, my father wired her the money for a down payment on a luxury SUV. When she wanted to move to a high-rise apartment in Seattle, my mother raided her mutual funds to cover the first, last, and security deposit. They bought her success. They funded her lifestyle, subsidizing an illusion of wealth while she worked mid-level tech jobs. I watched them drain their savings year after year, enabling a sister who believed the world owed her a red carpet. I never complained. I just kept my head down, analyzing spreadsheets and building a quiet, stable life. I did not want their money. I just wanted them to show up for me the way they showed up for her. But the golden child dynamic is a dangerous trap. It is an unsustainable ecosystem built on the assumption that the money will never run out. Eventually, the child you spoil exhausts your resources. And when they do not suddenly learn how to budget or live within their means. They start looking for a way to steal someone else's. I thought their favoritism was just a painful reality I had to accept. I did not realize it was the exact mechanism that was about to destroy them. The breaking point did not happen overnight. It was a slow fracture leading up to the moment I decided to marry David. We met at a coffee shop near my office. He was an architect, quiet and thoughtful, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. He understood my family dynamic without judging it. When we got engaged, we did not ask my parents for a dime. We wanted the wedding to be ours, free from the ledger, free from the invisible debts my parents liked to collect. I called my mother to tell her the news, expecting the bare minimum of maternal joy. The conversation that followed was the first warning sign that the ledger had finally bankrupted their morality. David asked me to marry him on a quiet Tuesday evening in November. There were no flash mobs, no hidden photographers in the bushes, and no grand public spectacles. We were sitting on the floor of our living room, eating takeout, and looking over a set of architectural floor plans for a project he was designing. He moved a coffee cup out of the way, slid a simple platinum band across the blueprints, and asked if I wanted to build a life with him. It was grounded, certain, and entirely authentic. It was exactly what I wanted. We spent the next month researching venues across the state. We eventually chose a historic limestone estate out in the Texas Hill Country. It sat on 40 acres of wild bluebonnets and ancient live oak trees. The air out there smelled like roasted cedar and impending rain. The property had a natural stone amphitheater where the ceremony would take place and a glass-enclosed conservatory for the reception. We signed the contract and wired the deposit directly from our joint savings account. I did not ask my parents for a contribution. I did not want their money buying leverage over my guest list, my catering choices, or my timeline. I knew the rules of their financial gifts. Every dollar they handed out came with a string attached to debt that could be called in whenever Morgan needed a buffer. I bypassed all of that. I paid for my own dress, my own photographer, and my own catering. All I wanted from my parents was for them to show up, sit in the front row, and watch me start my own family. I waited until a quiet Sunday morning to call them. Sunday was their designated rest day in Florida, a time when they drank coffee on their patio and read the news. I sat at my kitchen island with a mug of black coffee, watching David sketch at the dining table and press dial. I had spent 32 years tempering my expectations. I had trained myself to expect the bare minimum from Richard and Diane. But some small, stubborn part of my brain still hoped for a normal reaction. A mother hearing her youngest daughter is getting married should offer a baseline level of joy. The phone rang 3 times before my mother picked up. I told her the news. I told her about David, the ring, the limestone estate, and the October date we had secured. I paused, waiting for the congratulatory pitch in her voice, waiting for her to ask about the dress or the flowers. Instead, I got a sigh. It was not a sigh of surprise or relief. It was a heavy, practiced exhale. It was the specific breath a person takes when they are being asked to do exhausting manual labor. "Riley," my mother said, stretching the syllables of my name into a complaint. "That is wonderful news. But you know your father is on a fixed pension now. We just cannot afford flights to Texas right now. The hotel rooms, the rental cars, the outfits. It is just too much of a stretch for our budget this year." I closed my eyes. The forensic accountant inside me immediately ran the numbers. My father had retired as a senior regional manager for a corporate logistics firm. They owned a 4-bedroom house in a gated community. I knew for a fact they maintained a robust portfolio of mutual funds and bonds. They were not wealthy in the sense of private jets, but they were miles away from poverty. The poverty my mother was citing was entirely imaginary. It was a convenient fabricated shield they deployed whenever I asked for a fraction of their time. I did not call her out on the lie. I stayed perfectly calm and offered the logical, undeniable solution. "Mom, I will pay for the flights," I said. "David and I have airline miles saved up. We will book your tickets today. We will cover the hotel rooms for the entire weekend. You will not have to spend a single dime out of pocket. All you have to do is pack a bag and get on the plane. And get." The line went silent. I had taken away her primary excuse, stripping the financial defense away and trapping her in a corner. I heard muffled voices on the other end of the line, the sound of a hand covering the receiver, a quick, whispered argument. Then the phone changed hands. My father's voice came through the speaker, gruff and defensive. "Riley, sweetheart, listen," my father said. "It is not just the money. My sciatica has been acting up terribly these past few weeks. The doctor said sitting on a plane for 3 hours would wreck my lumbar spine. I cannot be laid up in a hotel room during your big day in pain. It would ruin the event for everyone. We just cannot risk it." I stared at the wood grain on my kitchen island. 2 weeks earlier, my father had posted a dozen photos of himself playing 18 holes of golf at a local country club. A lumbar spine fragile enough to ground him from a direct flight to his daughter's wedding was somehow robust enough for a forceful backswing on the fairway. They were laying the groundwork for their absence. They were building a fortress of medical and financial excuses so they would not have to participate in my life. The truth had nothing to do with fixed pensions or spinal nerves. The truth was much simpler and much colder. Attending my wedding meant traveling to my state, sitting in an audience, and celebrating a milestone that did not revolve around Morgan. In the Taylor family ecosystem, dedicating time, attention, and resources to the contingency plan was a punishable offense. It upset the delicate balance they had created. If they came to Texas to celebrate me, they would have to acknowledge that I was building a successful, happy life without their funding and without their permission. I did not argue. I did not plead. I did not point out the golf photos or demand they tell me the truth. Arguing with people committed to misunderstanding you is a waste of breath. I told my father I understood and that I hoped his back felt better soon. I ended the call, set the phone face down on the counter, and took a sip of my coffee. David looked up from his sketches, reading the expression on my face. He did not ask what happened. He just walked over, wrapped his arms around my shoulders, and held me. I filed the rejection away in the deepest part of my mind and went back to planning my wedding. I assumed that was the end of it. I assumed my parents would simply stay in Florida, send a generic greeting card in the mail, and pretend the day never happened. I had made my peace with their absence. But 4 weeks before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, the narrative abruptly shifted. My sister made a phone call of her own, and the imaginary poverty my parents had weaponized against me miraculously vanished. I spent the month of September finalizing the catering menu and addressing the remaining wedding envelopes. I was sitting at the dining table on a rainy Tuesday evening, surrounded by calligraphy pens and postage stamps. David was at the gym. The house was quiet, save for the sound of the rain against the living room windows. I had accepted my parents' excuses. I had drawn a line through their names on the seating chart, moving them to the mental archives. Then my old iPad lit up on the edge of the table. To understand what happened next, you have to understand a small digital oversight. 10 years ago, when I was in college, my father set up a primary family email account and an Apple ID to share music purchases and calendar events. We all shared the password. When I moved to Texas and started my career, I created my own accounts, but my old iPad remained logged into that original family network. It sat in a drawer most of the year, used occasionally as a secondary monitor for my accounting spreadsheets. I rarely paid attention to the notifications that flashed across the screen. But that evening, a bright white banner caught my eye. It was an email receipt forwarded from my father's primary inbox. The subject line read, "Delta Airlines Flight Confirmation." I set my pen down. I did not intend to pry, but human curiosity is a difficult instinct to suppress. I tapped the glass screen. The receipt loaded, displaying a sleek corporate logo and a 6-character confirmation code, 2 round-trip tickets from Tampa International Airport to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The cabin class was listed right below the passenger names. First class. The total cost charged to my father's credit card was $2,400. I stared at the screen, my mind taking a moment to process the geography. Seattle was 3,000 miles away from Florida. It was a 5.5-hour direct flight across 4 time zones. My father, the man whose sciatica was supposedly so severe that a short hop to Texas was a medical impossibility, had just booked a cross-country journey in a premium cabin. My eyes drifted down to the itinerary dates. The departure was scheduled for Thursday, October 14th. The return flight was Monday, October 18th. My wedding day was Saturday, October 16th. I felt a strange sensation in my chest, a cold tightening that had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with clarity. They were not staying in Florida to rest. They were actively booking a vacation for the exact weekend I was scheduled to walk down the aisle. Before I could process the airline tickets, the iPad buzzed again. A second receipt populated the inbox. This one was from a short-term rental platform. It was a confirmation for a 4-night stay in a luxury penthouse located in Belltown, a high-end neighborhood in downtown Seattle. The listing photos embedded in the email showed floor-to-ceiling windows, a wraparound balcony, and an unobstructed view of the Space Needle. The nightly rate was staggering. The total charge, including taxes and cleaning fees, came to $3,500. A third email arrived 3 minutes later. A receipt from a designer boutique in Tampa. 1 custom navy evening gown along with expedited tailoring fees. $1,800. A fourth email showed a charge from a men's formal wear retailer for a bespoke suit rental. $1,200. I sat at my dining table surrounded by my modest wedding invitations and watched the financial ledger of my parents' priorities materialize in real time. I am a forensic accountant. I do not react to rumors or emotions. I react to data. I pulled a yellow legal pad from my work bag and picked up a pen. I wrote down the cost of the flights, the penthouse, the gown, and the suit. I added estimated costs for dining, ground transportation, and incidentals. The total expenditure sat just below $9,500. $9,500 spent in a single afternoon. This was the same fixed pension my mother had cited just 3 weeks earlier. This was the same household budget that supposedly could not sustain the cost of a $200 economy ticket to watch their youngest daughter get married. The question was no longer if they were lying to me. The question was why they were going to Seattle. The answer arrived an hour later, not through a private phone call to me, but through a group text message my mother sent to our extended family. The notification popped up on my phone carrying a tone of breathless excitement. "Wonderful news," my mother typed to a dozen aunts, uncles, and cousins. "Our brilliant Morgan has just been named an equity partner at Vanguard Logistics. We are flying to Seattle to celebrate her at a formal yacht gala. We are bursting with pride." Morgan had called them earlier that afternoon. She had snapped her fingers, produced a shiny new corporate title, and demanded an audience. The firm was hosting an induction gala on a privately chartered yacht in Puget Sound. The event required black tie attire and was scheduled for the third weekend of October. Not a single sentence in my mother's paragraph acknowledged the scheduling conflict. Not a single cousin chimed in to ask if anyone remembered that I was getting married that same weekend. The family dynamic operated exactly as designed. Morgan was the sun, and the rest of us were just planetary debris expected to orbit her achievements. The imaginary poverty my parents had built to keep me at a distance vanished instantly. The fixed pensions suddenly found liquidity. The fragile lumbar spine miraculously healed. They did not hesitate. They did not look at a calendar and tell Morgan they had a prior commitment to their other daughter in Texas. They simply opened their wallets and booked a transcontinental flight to ensure they were standing on that yacht. As an auditor, my daily life revolves around identifying discrepancies. I look at corporate ledgers and search for the spaces where the narrative does not match the financial footprint. A chief executive claims the company is thriving, but the supply chain invoices tell a story of bankruptcy. You learn very quickly that people will lie with their words, but they will never lie with their money. Where a person allocates their capital is the purest expression of their truth. My parents had allocated $200 to a grocery budget and claimed they were broke. They then allocated $9,500 to a party and claimed they were proud. The discrepancy was solved. A different kind of daughter would have picked up the phone. A different daughter would have called her parents, demanded an explanation, and screamed until her throat was raw. She would have asked how they could justify spending nearly $10,000 on a cocktail party while leaving an empty row of chairs at her wedding ceremony. She would have pleaded for them to realize the cruelty of their choice. I did not make that call. I sat in the quiet of my home and looked at the numbers on my legal pad. Numbers are impartial. They do not carry guilt, and they do not offer apologies. They just tell the story exactly as it is. The $9,500 was a receipt for their affection. It was tangible proof that their love was conditional, allocated only to the child who offered them the most glamorous reflection of themselves. I tore the sheet of paper off the legal pad, folded it in half, and dropped it into the recycling bin. I closed the cover on the iPad, severing the digital connection to their inbox. I did not shed a single tear. Crying requires a sense of loss, and you cannot lose something you never truly had. The math was final. The ledger was closed. They had made their choice, investing their entire financial and emotional capital into Morgan's corporate illusion. I went back to addressing my wedding envelopes. I wrote the names of David's family, my college friends, and my colleagues. I built a guest list, composed entirely of people who chose to be there. I prepared myself for the physical reality of the wedding day, knowing the cameras would capture the empty space where my parents were supposed to sit. I had no idea that their expensive journey to Seattle was not a victory lap. They thought they were flying across the country to celebrate my sister's brilliance. They did not know they were funding the first phase of their own financial ruin. The collision course was set, and the yacht party in Puget Sound was about to become the most expensive mistake of their lives. October 16th arrived with the kind of weather that makes the Texas Hill Country feel like a sanctuary. The morning air carried a crisp chill that burned off by noon, settling into a flawless 75 degrees. The sky was an unbroken expanse of deep, vivid blue. I stood on the second-floor balcony of the estate holding a cup of herbal tea and watched the vendors set up the ceremony space down below. The florist was weaving white roses and eucalyptus branches through the iron archway. The catering staff laid out crisp linen tablecloths in the glass conservatory. Everything was moving according to the schedule I had meticulously designed. But my eyes were drawn to the stone amphitheater where the vows would take place, specifically to the seating arrangement. The layout was a stark physical representation of my life. On the left side of the aisle, David's family was already arriving. You could hear them before you saw them. His parents, aunts, uncles, and cousins moved as a loud, warm, joyful collective. They hugged the staff. They took photos near the oak trees. They filled all 40 of their allotted chairs with an energy that felt effortless. David's mother, a retired schoolteacher who treated me like her own daughter from the day we met, was pinning corsages onto the lapels of her nephews. The right side of the aisle told a different story. My side held my college roommates, a few trusted colleagues from the accounting firm, and a handful of friends who had flown in from out of state. They were wonderful people, but they barely filled 3 rows. At the very front, closest to the altar, sat a row of 6 heavy mahogany chairs. They were reserved for the parents of the bride, the siblings, and the immediate extended family. They were entirely empty. An hour before the ceremony, my wedding coordinator, a sharp professional named Elena, walked into the bridal suite holding her clipboard. She looked at me, then looked out the window at the seating arrangement. She cleared her throat, trying to navigate the awkwardness with gentle diplomacy. "Riley," Elena said softly, "we have a gap in the front row on the bride's side. If you want, I can have the grounds crew strike those mahogany chairs. We can shift the second row forward. It will tighten up the visuals for the photographer. No one will even notice the empty space." I looked at the 6 vacant seats. A weaker version of myself would have let her remove them. A daughter still hoping to protect her parents' reputation would have hidden the evidence of their abandonment, pretending the seating chart was just a logistical quirk. "Leave them," I told her. Elena blinked, her pen hovering over the clipboard. "Are you sure the photos might look a little unbalanced?" "I am sure," I replied. "Do not move a single chair." I wanted that physical monument. I wanted every guest, every camera lens, and every videographer to capture the exact shape of my parents' priorities. I wanted the empty mahogany to stand as a permanent historical record of the day Richard and Diane chose a corporate cocktail party over their youngest daughter. I would not protect them from the visual consequences of their actions. Elena nodded, made a single check mark on her board, and quietly stepped out of the room. I sat down in front of the vanity mirror. My makeup artist began applying a light layer of blush, her brushes moving in soft rhythmic strokes. The suite smelled of hairspray and the fresh lilies sitting in a vase by the door. It was supposed to be a moment of quiet reflection. It was the window of time where a mother typically stands behind her daughter, adjusts the veil, and offers some tearful words of generational wisdom. My reflection showed a woman sitting alone. Then, the phone resting on the vanity counter vibrated. I had turned off text notifications to avoid distractions, but I had forgotten to silence social media alerts. The screen lit up with an Instagram push notification. It was not a direct message. It was a tag. My sister Morgan had initiated a live video broadcast and tagged the old family account, pushing the alert directly to my screen. I reached out and tapped the notification. The quiet atmosphere of my bridal suite was instantly shattered by the sound of a heavy bass line and the clinking of glassware. The video feed filled my screen, bright and chaotic. The camera panned across the polished teak deck of a luxury yacht. The gray, towering skyline of Seattle sat in the background, framed by the choppy waters of Puget Sound. Waiters in white tuxedo jackets walked through the frame, carrying silver trays of oysters and champagne. The wind whipped past the microphone, distorting the audio, but the visual was painfully clear. Morgan stepped into the center of the frame. She wore a sequined emerald dress, holding a microphone in one hand and a cocktail in the other. She laughed, tossing her hair over her shoulder, basking in the attention of her new corporate colleagues. Then the camera swung to the right. My mother stepped into the shot. She was wearing the custom navy evening gown I had seen on the electronic receipt. Her hair was professionally styled. She leaned in, grabbed Morgan by the shoulders, and kissed her on the cheek. "My brilliant girl," my mother yelled over the music, staring directly into the camera lens. "We are so incredibly proud of you, Morgan. Equity partner. You earned every bit of this." My father appeared next. He was wearing the bespoke rented suit. He looked healthy, vibrant, and entirely free of the imaginary back pain that supposedly kept him grounded in Florida. He raised a crystal flute of champagne high into the air. To Morgan, my father shouted, his face flushed with excitement. The smartest woman in Seattle. I sat in the velvet chair of the bridal suite wearing my white dress and watched my parents celebrate. They did not look conflicted. They did not look like people torn between two obligations. They looked triumphant. They were standing on a rented boat surrounded by strangers pouring their entire emotional reservoir into a daughter whose only achievement was a bought and paid for corporate title. I watched the live viewer count tick upward in the corner of the screen. I watched the comments roll in from aunts and cousins congratulating Morgan on her success. Not a single person in the chat mentioned the date. Not a single voice on that yacht acknowledged that somewhere in Texas, a daughter was preparing to walk down an aisle. It was as if I did not exist. They had not just abandoned me. They had erased me from the family calendar entirely. The makeup artist stood frozen behind me, her brush hovering in the air. She had heard the audio. She saw the reflection of the video playing on my phone. She did not know what to say. The door to the bridal suite opened with a quiet click. David walked in. He was wearing a tailored charcoal suit, his tie perfectly straight. He was technically breaking tradition by seeing me before the ceremony, but David never cared about archaic rules when he knew I needed him. He took one look at my posture, the rigid set of my shoulders, and the glowing screen in my hand. He crossed the room in 3 long strides. He did not ask what I was watching. He did not ask how I felt. He simply reached down, took the phone from my fingers, and pressed the power button. The screen went dark, cutting off the baseline, cutting off my father's toast, cutting off the illusion. David set the phone face down on a side table far out of reach. He knelt beside my chair, placing his hands over mine. His grip was warm, solid, and entirely present. "They do not get to ruin today," David said. His voice was low and steady, carrying the weight of an undeniable fact. "They do not get a single second of your energy today. You are here. I am here. We are building our own family now. The people sitting outside are the ones who matter." I looked into his eyes and felt the cold knot in my chest dissolve. He was right. The grief I had been carrying for 32 years, the desperate lingering hope that my parents would eventually realize my worth simply evaporated. It was replaced by a profound clinical clarity. I stood up. I let the makeup artist finish her work. I let the coordinator pin my veil into place. I did not shed a single tear for Richard and Diane. I was done paying the emotional tax of being the forgotten daughter. I was ready to walk past those empty mahogany chairs. I was ready to make a silent promise to myself, a vow of absolute detachment that would ultimately serve as the trap they walked blindly into. The string quartet shifted their tempo. The notes rose clear and sharp against the evening breeze. I stood at the beginning of the stone pathway. I did not stand alone. David's father waited beside me. His name was Thomas. He had spent 3 decades working as a public high school principal. He was a man who navigated thousands of adolescent crises with a steady and unflinching fairness. He never raised his voice, but when he spoke, people listened. He understood the assignment today. He knew exactly what those empty chairs represented, and he stepped into the gap without a single ounce of pity. Thomas extended his arm. His tuxedo sleeve felt rough and solid under my fingertips. He smiled with a genuine warmth that reached the corners of his eyes. "It is the honor of my life to walk with you, Riley," he said. We walked down the aisle together. The crushed limestone pathway ground softly beneath our shoes. As we approached the front rows, I kept my chin parallel to the ground. I glided right past the 6 empty mahogany chairs. A few hours earlier, the sight of that vacant wood might have bruised my spirit. But standing there surrounded by the rustling oak trees and the faces of people who had traveled across the country to witness my happiness, the emptiness felt remarkably different. It did not feel like a void, it felt like a cauterized wound. The bleeding had stopped, The space was clean. David stood at the altar. The late afternoon sun caught the edge of his jaw. He looked at me with a level of devotion that rendered everything outside of that amphitheater irrelevant. We spoke our vows, sliding gold bands onto our fingers. We kissed, and the crowd erupted into authentic, unprompted applause. The reception took place inside the glass conservatory, illuminated by hundreds of suspended candles. The night was a blur of motion and joy. I drank dry champagne from a crystal flute. I danced until the hem of my silk dress turned gray with dust. I watched my college roommates laugh with David's cousins. I watched Thomas spin his wife around the dance floor, moving with the easy rhythm of a couple who had spent 40 years choosing each other every single day. I realized something profound as I watched them interact. Family is an action. It is not a biological default. It is a daily decision to show up, to honor your commitments, and to protect the people you claim to love. Richard and Diane shared my genetics, but they were not my family. They were just two people who happened to raise me before abandoning their post. That night, lying in the dark of our hotel suite, I made a quiet vow. I chose an unyielding, suffocating silence. Society conditions us to believe that reconciliation is always the ultimate goal. We are taught that holding a grudge is unhealthy and that communication is the only path to healing. But here is the truth about dealing with malignant family dynamics. Their greatest fear is not your anger. Their greatest fear is your apathy. When people wrong you deeply, they expect you to chase them. They want you to call them up and scream. They crave the confrontation because anger is a currency. It proves you are still tethered to their ecosystem. If I had called my mother the next morning to scream about the yacht in Seattle, she would have possessed the exact ammunition she needed. She would have muted her phone, looked at her sister, and painted me as the hysterical, jealous daughter. She would have spun a narrative where Morgan was the victim of my unhinged envy. Anger gives them a script. It gives them a role to play and an audience to manipulate. I refuse to hand them a script. I refuse to let them weaponize my grief to recruit other relatives to their side. If you scream, they win. If you explain, they argue. But if you give them a total blackout, they starve. The next morning, before our flight to the airport, David went down to the lobby to grab coffee. I sat at the small desk in our suite, opened my laptop, and began the clinical process of erasure. I approached it with the same methodical precision I used during a corporate audit. In forensic accounting, when a ledger is irredeemably corrupt, you do not try to balance it. You write it off as a total loss and close the account. I was writing off my family as a total loss. I logged into the human resources portal for my accounting firm. I scrolled down to the emergency contacts section. Richard and Diane were listed at the top. I clicked delete, typed in David's name, and added Thomas as the secondary contact. I logged into my healthcare provider's patient portal. I navigated to the privacy settings and revoked my parents' authorizations, stripping them of any legal right to access my medical records or make decisions on my behalf. I opened my life insurance policy and removed them as contingent beneficiaries. I did not block their phone numbers. Blocking someone is a defensive move that signals you are protecting yourself from their reach. Instead, I simply switched their contact profiles to a silent ringtone and routed their calls directly to a separate voicemail folder. They could speak into the void for the rest of their lives, and I would never have to hear it. It was a digital cremation. I swept away every administrative tie to my existence. By the time David returned with the coffee, I had closed the laptop. My old life was gone. We flew to Costa Rica that afternoon. We spent 6 days in the coastal town of Tamarindo. We surfed in the warm Pacific water. We ate fresh mangoes on the beach. We slept to the rhythmic, unbroken sound of the ocean waves crashing against the cliffs below our villa. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of salt water. For the first time in 32 years, I was not anticipating the next demand. I was not bracing myself for the next time I would be asked to shrink my life to accommodate my sister's ego. I was free. Let them have their yacht, I thought. Let them have their golden child. I had built a fortress they could not breach. I assumed my silence was a permanent shield. I thought the ledger was closed forever, gathering dust in the archives of my memory. I had no intention of ever looking at Morgan's life again. I did not want revenge. I just wanted peace. But silence is a strange mechanism. Sometimes when you remove yourself from a toxic structure, you remove the only load-bearing pillar keeping the entire building from collapsing. By walking away, I left them alone with their own greed. Without me there to absorb the impact of Morgan's mistakes, the consequences had nowhere to go, but straight back to my parents. While I was walking the beaches of Costa Rica soaking in the sun and building my new marriage, an extensive corporate compliance file was being assembled on a mahogany desk in Austin, Texas. It was a thick, highly confidential dossier detailing a multi-million-dollar private equity acquisition. It contained the exact financial blueprint of Morgan's fake empire, and it was waiting for me to return to the office. I did not know it yet, but my silent retreat had set a trap. My profession was about to collide with my past, forcing me to review the very transaction my parents had flown across the country to celebrate. The quiet peace of my honeymoon was winding down, and the true cost of Morgan's yacht party was about to cross my desk. The transition back to reality was seamless. 6 weeks after I walked down the aisle, the Costa Rican sun faded into the crisp, climate-controlled air of my accounting firm in downtown Austin. I took the elevator to the 14th floor holding a cardboard cup of black coffee and walked into a bullpen of glass-walled offices. The environment was predictably silent. Our firm specialized in high-risk corporate audits. We did not celebrate loudly. We did not engage in water-cooler gossip. We spent our days dissecting financial ecosystems, searching for the rot hidden beneath glossy corporate brochures. My desk was an organized sanctuary. 2 wide monitors sat side by side, bordered by neat stacks of legal pads. I sat down, typed my security credentials into the system, and prepared to resume the quiet rhythm of my career. I felt grounded. The digital cremation of my family ties had worked. I had not received a single communication from Florida. The boundary was holding, and my mind was entirely focused on my work. My manager, a meticulous man named Marcus, knocked twice on my glass door before pushing it open. He did not carry physical folders. He held a secure, encrypted flash drive. He walked over and placed it on my desk next to my keyboard. "We have a priority acquisition on the board," Marcus said, keeping his voice low. A private equity firm out of New York is looking to execute an $80 million buyout of a tech logistics company based in Seattle. The target is called Vanguard Logistics. The buyers want a full forensic sweep of their executive equity before they sign the term sheets. They need to know if the leadership team is carrying any hidden liabilities. I nodded, plugging the drive into the secure terminal. The protocol for a buyout of that size was strict. Before I could even look at the ledgers or the bank statements, I had to complete a preliminary clearance. It was a mandatory conflict of interest screening regulated by the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. The rule is simple and unforgiving. An auditor cannot investigate a company if they have a personal financial or familial tie to any of its executives. The first step of any forensic audit is opening the executive roster and running the names against our internal databases. It is usually a tedious, unremarkable task. I opened the digital dossier. The screen filled with a long list of corporate officers, board members, and equity partners. I picked up my pen, ready to check the names off my legal pad. I scanned the top-tier executives, the chief executive officer, the chief financial officer, the vice president of operations. Then my eyes moved to the list of newly minted equity partners. The pen stopped moving. The blue light from the monitors reflected off the glass walls of my office. The ambient hum of the air conditioning seemed to drop away entirely. Listed on the 4th line of the Vanguard Logistics executive roster was the name Morgan Taylor. The universe possesses a very dark sense of irony, but forensic accounting leaves no room for humor or coincidence. I stared at the name. It was the exact title my mother had bragged about in her group text. Equity partner. It was the exact industry. Tech logistics. It was the exact city. Seattle. The yacht party in Puget Sound was not a celebration of a random job promotion. It was an induction into this specific company, the very company sitting on my desk waiting to be audited. A sudden sharp chill traveled down my spine. The two worlds I had worked so hard to separate had just collided on my dual monitors. I did not panic. I did not let my hands shake. I am a licensed, certified public accountant. My profession is governed by strict federal laws and ethical boundaries. Auditing a family member during a corporate buyout is a severe federal violation. It is the kind of ethical breach that revokes licenses and ruins careers. I knew instantly that I could not proceed with the forensic sweep. I could not investigate Vanguard Logistics. I was legally obligated to recuse myself from the project. I pushed my chair back from the desk. I planned to walk straight into Marcus's office, hand him the encrypted drive, and explain that I had a direct familial conflict of interest. I mentally drafted the formal recusal memo. I would cite the regulatory codes, pass the file to another senior auditor, and wash my hands of the entire Seattle operation. But corporate compliance protocols require documentation. A common surname on a spreadsheet is not enough to trigger a formal recusal on an $80 million acquisition. Taylor is a frequent last name. To legally justify handing the file back, standard operating procedure required me to verify the familial link. I had to prove that the Morgan Taylor on the screen was actually my sister and not a stranger who shared her name. To do that, I needed to access Vanguard's public financial disclosures and pull the preliminary escrow data. It is a surface-level check, just enough to verify a social security number, a date of birth, or a primary residential address. I pulled my chair back to the desk. I opened the secondary secure portal and accessed the Washington State Corporate Registry. I typed in Vanguard Logistics and requested the equity buy-in records for their newest partners. The system buffered for 10 seconds. A green loading bar crawled across the screen. Those 10 seconds were the last moments of peace I would have regarding my family. The document populated on my right monitor. It was Morgan's executive profile. It included her date of birth. It included the address of the luxury apartment my parents had helped her secure. The verification was complete. It was definitively my sister. I had the proof I needed to walk away from the audit. But my eyes did not stop at her address. They drifted down the page to the financial disclosures attached to her new corporate title. In the corporate world, an equity partnership is rarely a gift, given solely for hard work. It is a financial transaction. A company allows you to claim a percentage of their profits, but you have to buy your seat at the table. The charter required every new partner to inject a specific amount of capital into the firm to secure their voting rights and their equity share. I looked at the capital injection requirement listed next to Morgan's name. The number printed on the screen was $1.5 million. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I leaned closer to the monitor, reading the digits again to ensure I had not misplaced a decimal point. $1,500,000. According to the legally binding corporate charter, Morgan's promotion was not a reward for merit. She had purchased the title. To stand on that yacht in Puget Sound and drink champagne as an equity partner, she was required to wire $1.5 million into the Vanguard Logistics escrow account. I knew my sister's financial reality better than anyone. Morgan was 34 years old. She leased a European car she could barely afford. She carried $40,000 in high-interest credit card debt. She routinely asked my parents to cover her rent when she spent her paycheck on designer clothes. She did not have $1.5 million. She did not even have $15,000 in liquid assets. A cold, clinical alarm bell began ringing in the back of my mind. The money had to come from somewhere. The private equity firm acquiring Vanguard needed to know the origin of the executive capital. If the buy-in funds were illegitimate, the entire $80 million acquisition was at risk. I was supposed to close the file. I was supposed to draft my recusal walk-away and let another auditor find the discrepancy. But forensic accounting is just the act of pulling on a loose thread until the entire sweater unravels. I was staring at a thread that connected my sister to a 7-figure financial transaction. I did not close the file. I typed a new command into the terminal requesting the origination data for the escrow wire transfers. The 3 minutes I spent waiting for the banking codes to clear would change the trajectory of my entire life. The numbers that appeared on my screen next were about to reveal exactly how my parents paid for their trip to Seattle. The loading icon on my secondary monitor spun in a slow, relentless circle. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, waiting for the secure network to retrieve the escrow origination data for Vanguard Logistics. In the world of forensic accounting, money is never silent. People can fabricate impressive resumes. They can print glossy business cards featuring the words, equity partner. They can rent luxury yachts and hire catering staffs to pour expensive champagne. They can build an entire aesthetic of success built on nothing but arrogance and a steady supply of validation. But they cannot fabricate a banking trail. Capital leaves a permanent, undeniable footprint. You can hide your motive, but you can never hide a routing number. I was waiting for the routing numbers that funded Morgan's $1.5 million buy-in. While the system verified my credentials and pulled the federal wire logs, I thought about my sister's actual financial reality. To the guests on that yacht in Puget Sound, she looked like a brilliant young tech executive. She wore an emerald dress that cost more than a standard mortgage payment. She carried herself with the careless confidence of someone who had conquered her industry. To an auditor, she looked like a walking liability. Morgan had spent her entire adult life running from financial accountability. Her credit profile was a disaster. I knew this because our family ledger was never truly private. My parents frequently discussed her debts, usually right before they asked me to help pay them. She carried $40,000 in revolving credit card debts spread across 5 different high-interest accounts. She leased a European luxury sedan she routinely complained about fueling. She bought status symbols instead of equity. She rented high-rise apartments she could not afford, relying on my mother to quietly cover the utility bills. A person with that specific financial footprint does not wake up on a Tuesday with $1.5 million in liquid assets. If a legitimate venture capital firm had reviewed her credit history, they would have laughed her out of the boardroom. If she had walked into a commercial bank and requested a 7-figure business loan to buy into a logistics firm, the underwriters would have denied the application before she finished her coffee. Traditional lending institutions require collateral, pristine credit, and a proven track record of revenue. Morgan had none of those things. The money had to originate from a private source. The screen flashed green. The buffering icon vanished, replaced by a dense text, heavy spreadsheet detailing the Vanguard Logistics escrow account. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the edge of the desk. I filtered the spreadsheet, searching for the transaction ID attached to Morgan's partnership agreement. I found her row. I highlighted the cell containing the capital injection data and expanded the transaction history. The $1.5 million did not arrive in Seattle as a single lump sum. It was broken down into a series of 3 separate wire transfers. I studied the dates. The first transfer cleared on September 12th, exactly 1 month before my wedding. The amount was $500,000. The second transfer cleared on September 15th, another $500,000. The final transfer arrived on September 18th, completing the requirement. Staggering the wires in equal installments is a common tactic used to bypass internal risk management flags at smaller regional banks. A sudden withdrawal of $1.5 million often triggers a manual review by a bank manager. Breaking it into smaller fractions keeps the automated systems quiet, just long enough to move the funds across state lines. Someone had orchestrated this transfer with a deliberate, calculated urgency. I moved my cursor to the next column. I needed to identify the sending institution. I expected to see the name of a predatory private equity lender. I expected to see a shadow investor, or perhaps a high-risk wealth management firm known for funding desperate tech executives. Instead, I saw a standard 9-digit American Bankers Association routing number. I copied the 9 digits. I opened the institutional database provided by the Federal Reserve and pasted the routing number into the search bar. I hit enter. The geographic location did not trace back to a skyscraper in Manhattan, It did not trace back to a venture capital hub in Silicon Valley. It bypassed the corporate world entirely. The search result returned a match for Suncoast Credit Union. My heart executed a slow, heavy beat against my ribs. I stared at the name of the financial institution. The headquarters were listed in Tampa, Florida. It was not an investment bank. It was a regional credit union. It was a modest financial institution built for public school teachers, local business owners, and retirees living on fixed incomes. It was the exact credit union where my parents had maintained their primary checking and savings accounts for the last 30 years. It was the bank where my father deposited his biweekly pension checks. It was the bank where my mother kept her modest grocery budget. It was the bank they had cited as the reason they could not afford a $200 airplane ticket to watch me get married. I felt the air leave my office. The climate-controlled oxygen suddenly felt thin and inadequate. The ambient noise of my colleagues walking past my glass door faded into a dull ringing in my ears. I did not move. I just stared at the dual monitors, watching the reality of my parents' decisions reconfigure itself in real time. My parents had not just skipped my wedding to attend a party, they had purchased the party. They had funded the entire illusion. $1.5 million is not spare change. It is not an amount of money you find by tightening your budget or skipping a few vacations. For a middle-class couple living in a Tampa suburb, $1.5 million represents generational wealth. It is the sum total of 3 decades of continuous labor. It is the physical manifestation of every early morning commute, every skipped luxury, and every carefully managed tax return. I knew my parents' financial portfolio. I knew the value of their assets because I had helped my father organize his retirement projections when I was in college. They did not have $1.5 million sitting in a liquid checking account. They had a healthy mutual fund. They had my father's 401k, and they had a 4-bedroom house in a gated community that they had spent 25 years paying off. To generate $1.5 million in cash, they would have had to liquidate every single asset they owned. They would have had to drain their retirement accounts, swallow the massive early withdrawal tax penalties, and leverage the equity in their home. The math was apocalyptic. They had wired their entire existence to a logistics firm in Seattle so their oldest daughter could call herself an equity partner. They had essentially set their own house on fire to keep Morgan warm. I sat back in my chair, pressing the palms of my hands against my eyes. The sheer scale of the financial devastation was difficult to process. I was angry at their hypocrisy, yes. I was furious that they had claimed poverty to avoid celebrating my marriage while secretly wiring a fortune across the country. But as the initial shock subsided, the forensic auditor inside my brain woke up. Something was fundamentally wrong with the transaction. The numbers did not align with the psychological profile of the people involved. My mother was prone to making emotional financial decisions, but my father was entirely different. Richard Taylor was a man terrified of debt. He hated the concept of borrowing money. He had worked overtime for 10 years just to pay off his mortgage early because he could not stand the idea of a bank holding the deed to his property. He checked his retirement balances every Friday. He was a conservative, risk-averse man who viewed his home as his ultimate sanctuary. My father might have given Morgan his spare cash. He might have even drained a small savings account to help her secure an apartment. But he never would have risked the roof over his head. He never would have signed the deed to his house over to a bank to fund a corporate buy-in. He would have drawn a line. If my father did not authorize the liquidation of his house, then the wire transfers originating from that credit union were not a voluntary gift. I dropped my hands onto the desk. I looked back at the screen, staring at the Tampa routing number. The money had moved. The wire transfers were executed. The corporate charter was signed. But if my father had not willingly signed the loan documents to leverage his home, there was only one other explanation. I reached for my keyboard. I needed to pull the public property records for their house in Florida. I needed to see the signatures on the loan origination documents. The conflict of interest screening was no longer just a professional formality. It was turning into a live investigation of federal wire fraud, and the primary suspect was the woman drinking champagne on the yacht. So, I opened a new secure browser window on my right monitor. I navigated away from the corporate escrow database and logged into the Hillsborough County Property Appraiser portal. Public records are the great equalizer in forensic accounting. Anyone can build a convincing lie. A person can rent a luxury vehicle, wear designer clothing, and project an image of limitless wealth. But real estate transactions are recorded by the state. The county clerk does not care about your aesthetic. The clerk only cares about the deed. I typed in the address of the house I grew up in. It was a modest single-story structure with a screened lanai and a two-car garage. My parents had lived there for 30 years. The page loaded, displaying the parcel summary, the tax assessment history, and the official records timeline. I scrolled down to the recorded documents section. I expected to see the original warranty deed from the late 1980s. I expected to see the satisfaction of mortgage document my father had proudly filed when he submitted his final payment. But sitting at the very top of the ledger, dated just 6 weeks prior, was a new entry. It was a deed of trust securing a home equity line of credit. I clicked the hyperlink to view the scanned digital file of the legal filing. The document loaded on my screen, revealing the terms of the lien against the property. The principal amount listed on the public filing was $800,000. The bank had issued a maximum credit line against the accumulated equity of the house. That filing accounted for just over half of the stolen funds. I needed to find the remaining $700,000 to match the escrow deposit in Seattle. I switched back to the federal wire logs and traced the corresponding routing inputs that matched the Tampa Credit Union. The trail bypassed their standard checking accounts and led directly to my father's retirement portfolio. It was a complete, unpenalized liquidation of his 401k. He had cashed out the entire balance of his career savings. By emptying the account before the legal retirement age, he had triggered a severe early withdrawal penalty. He absorbed a heavy tax hit just to pull the cash out the door. $800,000 extracted from the house. $700,000 extracted from the retirement fund. The sum totaled exactly $1.5 million. The math was flawless. The psychology was entirely wrong. My father treated financial debt like a contagious airborne disease. When I was 12 years old, he hosted a barbecue in our backyard for the sole purpose of burning his final mortgage statement in a charcoal grill. He stood on the patio with a pair of metal tongs holding the paper over the flames and told me to never let a commercial bank own the roof over my head. He spent months researching interest rates just to buy a used lawnmower. A man with that specific psychological profile does not voluntarily sign a document giving a commercial lender the right to foreclose on his sanctuary. He would rather sleep in his car than leverage the equity in his house. If he did not walk into a bank and sign those loan documents, someone else did it for him. I pulled the origination packet for the home equity line of credit. I scrolled to the final page to view the authorization signatures. They were not executed with a blue ink pen. They were digital stamps. Someone had used an electronic document signing service to execute the loan from a remote computer. Attached to the digital signature file was a supplemental legal document. It was a durable financial power of attorney. I recognized the date printed at the top of the proxy form. 3 years ago, my father experienced a minor cardiac event. He spent 5 days in a telemetry ward for observation. Morgan flew down from Seattle playing the role of the devoted oldest daughter. While he was lying in a hospital bed medicated and anxious about his health, Morgan placed a stack of legal paperwork on his tray table. She convinced him to sign a legal proxy, claiming she needed it to help manage his medical billing and insurance claims while he recovered. My father signed it without consulting an attorney. Morgan took the original notarized copy back to Washington State. She never relinquished the authority. She kept that document in her desk for 3 years, waiting for the precise moment she needed capital. She used that 3-year-old document to legally bypass my parents. She initiated the $800,000 loan application online, acting as his designated financial proxy. But securing a loan of that magnitude requires more than a digital signature. Financial institutions employ fraud prevention protocols. Before releasing the funds, an underwriter is required to make a verbal confirmation call to the primary residential phone number listed on the account. My parents still used a traditional landline. I checked the telecom routing history attached to the credit union application. Morgan had not just forged the signature. She had executed a sophisticated digital hijacking. Morgan contacted their local telecom provider. She verified her identity using the durable power of attorney and requested a service transfer. She ported my parents' Florida landline number to a voice-over internet protocol service. She routed their home phone directly to a Google Voice account installed on her cell phone in Seattle. When the underwriter from the credit union called the Florida house to verify the loan terms, the phone sitting on my parents' kitchen counter did not ring. The call bypassed the state entirely. Morgan answered the phone in her high-rise apartment 3,000 miles away. She impersonated the household, confirmed the loan details, and authorized the transfer of their entire net worth. My parents did not buy her a corporate title. They were entirely ignorant of the transaction. They thought Morgan had earned her promotion through sheer brilliance and corporate merit. They packed their bags, bought designer clothing, and flew across the country to celebrate a daughter they believed was a tech industry prodigy. They had no idea they were standing on that yacht while their own financial grave was being dug beneath their feet. It was textbook identity theft and federal wire fraud. Morgan had stolen $1.5 million from her own family to buy a seat at the Vanguard Logistics boardroom table. But as I stared at the corporate escrow accounts, a new discrepancy caught my eye. A buyout of an $80 million logistics firm requires rigorous financial disclosures. If Morgan had deposited $1.5 million into the company, that capital should have been resting securely in their executive cash reserves. It was not there. I traced the internal corporate ledger. The money had entered Vanguard Logistics and immediately vanished. The firm was empty. Morgan had not just stolen my parents' life savings, she had fed it directly into a corporate machine that did not actually exist. The deeper I looked into Vanguard Logistics, the faster the illusion collapsed, leading me to a revelation that was about to trigger a federal raid. I stared at the zero balance on the Vanguard Logistics escrow ledger. In a legitimate corporate structure, capital injected by an incoming equity partner rests in a restricted holding account. It functions as a security measure, verifying the financial health of the executive team while the legal paperwork is finalized. Morgan deposited her stolen funds over a 3-day period in September. By the 4th day, the ledger showed a zero balance. The money had not been transferred into a corporate reserve. It had vanished into the operating accounts and scattered. I bypassed the surface-level disclosures and dug directly into their quarterly operational filings. I pulled their Regulation D exemption records from the Securities and Exchange Commission database. If an $80 million tech logistics company is moving freight across the country, their balance sheets must reflect the physical reality of a supply chain. I expected to see heavy line items for commercial warehouse leases, fleet maintenance contracts, diesel fuel expenditures, and union labor payrolls. The expense columns were essentially empty. Vanguard Logistics did not own a single commercial truck. They did not lease a single square foot of warehouse space. They did not possess a proprietary software platform capable of routing shipments. Their primary expenditures were categorized under marketing executive retreats and exorbitant consulting fees. They were a logistics company that moved zero freight. I pulled their inbound cash flow statements for the previous 24 months to see how they were generating the revenue to attract an $80 million buyout offer. Their income did not originate from shipping contracts or corporate clients. Their sole source of inbound cash was the buy-in fees extracted from newly recruited equity partners. It was a modern iteration of a Ponzi scheme. They were running a high-level pay-to-play scam. The founders of Vanguard had built a hollow corporate shell and dressed it up in the aesthetics of Silicon Valley success. They rented penthouse office spaces with skyline views. They leased luxury yachts. They threw lavish induction galas. They created a visual ecosystem designed to mimic extreme wealth. They did not recruit seasoned supply chain experts to join their board. They targeted a very specific psychological profile. The recruiters hunted for mid-level corporate workers who possessed more ego than actual talent. They looked for people who were desperate for an impressive title but lacked the work ethic to climb a traditional corporate ladder. Morgan was the perfect mark. Her entire adult life was defined by a desperate need to appear wealthy without doing the actual labor required to sustain it. She curated an influencer lifestyle on social media while holding mediocre jobs. She bought designer handbags on credit. She leased cars she could not afford. The architects of the Vanguard fraud saw her insecurity and weaponized it. They knew exactly how to hook someone who valued aesthetics over substance. The founders offered her a shortcut. They invited her to expensive dinners. They told her she possessed rare executive vision. They stroked her ego, handed her a glossy prospectus, and told her that a $1.5 million investment would secure her a vice president title and a permanent seat at the table. Morgan did not read the fine print. She did not ask to see the audited financials. She just saw the yacht. She saw the opportunity to call our parents and brag about her sudden ascent to the top of the corporate world. She forged our parents' signatures and stole their retirement to buy a ghost. I traced the outgoing wires from the Vanguard operating account to see where the Florida money actually went. It did not fund a new tech platform. The moment her final wire transfer cleared the escrow account, the funds were chopped into dozens of smaller transactions. A portion was funneled directly into the personal offshore bank accounts of the founding partners disguised as performance bonuses. Another portion was used to pay fake dividends to the older investors, creating the illusion of a profitable return to keep the scheme running. A significant chunk of that stolen cash was used to fund the induction party itself. The catering staff, the crystal champagne flutes, the live disc jockey, the yacht rental in Puget Sound. All of it was paid for using the equity stolen from my parents' Florida home. My mother and father flew 3,000 miles to drink champagne that was purchased with their own liquidated retirement funds. They thought they were celebrating their superior parenting. They thought they had finally proven that their endless investment in the golden child was correct. They were actually toasting to their own financial execution. The money was gone, evaporated. There was no holding account to freeze. There was no physical asset to liquidate and return to the victims. The criminal meat grinder had already processed the capital. Even if my parents realized the fraud tomorrow, they could never recover the cash. The bank would inevitably foreclose on their house, and the tax penalties from the early retirement withdrawal would bankrupt whatever remained of their lives. Vanguard Logistics had successfully conned my sister, and by extension my parents. But the founders of the scheme had made a fatal miscalculation. They had grown too greedy. The architects of the fraud wanted to cash out and walk away clean. They pitched their fake company to a New York private equity firm for $80 million, hoping to sell the shell before the foundation collapsed. They assumed the buyers would simply look at the inflated top-line revenue, observe the steady stream of incoming cash from the newest marks, and sign the term sheets. They did not anticipate that the private equity firm would hire an independent risk assessment agency in Texas. And they certainly did not anticipate that the forensic auditor assigned to clear the transaction would be the sister of their latest victim. I sat in my quiet glass office staring at the digital proof of a federal crime. The glow of the monitors illuminated the notes on my legal pad. I held the detonator to an $80 million acquisition. The professional protocol was clear. My loyalty as an auditor belonged to the acquiring firm and the federal regulatory agencies. But the personal implications of what I had to do next were staggering. Submitting this evidence to the authorities would trigger a chain reaction that could not be stopped. It would initiate an immediate federal raid on the Seattle headquarters. It would alert the Florida Credit Union to the wire fraud, triggering the immediate foreclosure of my childhood home. It would send my sister to a federal penitentiary for identity theft and embezzlement. I looked out the window of my office at the Austin skyline. The sky was turning a pale, bruised purple as the sun went down. The daughter my parents wanted me to be would have picked up the phone. She would have called Florida, warned them about the impending collapse, and tried to help them hide the remaining assets. But I had made a vow of absolute silence on the night of my wedding. I had to decide if I was willing to uphold that vow, even if it meant becoming the architect of their final ruin. I sat at my desk as the evening traffic began to clog the streets of Austin below. The glow of the monitors illuminated the legal pad in front of me. I had a decision to make, and it was the kind of choice that alters the gravity of your life. The daughter my parents raised would have reached for her smartphone. She would have dialed the Florida area code, warned them about the impending collapse, and advised them to hire a defense attorney before the bank seized their property. She would have tried to shield them from the consequences of their own favoritism. She would have found a way to blame the system or the logistics company instead of holding Morgan accountable. But that daughter did not exist anymore. She died on a Saturday afternoon in October, standing in a white dress while looking at an empty row of mahogany chairs. My vow of silence was not a temporary punishment designed to elicit an apology. It was a permanent operating procedure. I was not going to break my peace to save people who had gladly traded my milestone for a cocktail party. I gathered my notes. I placed the encrypted flash drive back into its plastic case. I stood up, walked out of my glass office, and knocked on the door of my manager. Marcus looked up from his keyboard, adjusting his glasses. I stepped inside and placed the drive on the center of his desk. "I have to formally recuse myself from the Vanguard Logistics acquisition," I said. My voice was steady, carrying the clinical tone of a professional. During the preliminary conflict of interest screening, I discovered that one of their newly inducted equity partners is my sibling. Proceeding with this audit would be a violation of my licensing. Marcus leaned back in his chair. He did not ask personal questions. He understood the legal weight of the situation. In our industry, maintaining an impartial distance is the only way to protect the integrity of the firm. He took the drive, thanked me for catching the conflict early, and assigned the $80 million file to another senior auditor. I walked back to my desk. My professional obligation to the firm was fulfilled. My license was protected. But my obligation to the law was just beginning. Handing the file back to my manager stopped me from auditing my sister, but it did not erase the federal crimes I had already uncovered. The forged loan documents the intercepted bank calls the phantom equity scheme. I could not simply close my eyes and pretend Vanguard Logistics was a legitimate operation. Turning a blind eye to a seven-figure financial crime when you possess the digital footprint makes you complicit. I opened a secure browser on my personal laptop. I navigated to the official portal for the Securities and Exchange Commission. I clicked on the submission link for SEC Rule 21F. Rule 21F is the federal whistleblower program. It was established to incentivize financial professionals to report corporate fraud by offering protections and anonymity. It is not a suggestion box or a customer service complaint line. It is a direct encrypted pipeline to federal investigators. When a licensed accountant submits a dossier through this portal, the agency moves with devastating speed. I did not draft an emotional essay. I did not mention the yacht party, the wedding, or the history of our family ledger. Federal agents do not care about sibling rivalry or ungrateful parents. They care about paper trails and jurisdictional authority. I provided them with a surgical, devastating summary of the facts. I uploaded the transaction IDs for the 3 wire transfers originating from the Florida Credit Union. I included the routing numbers. I attached the forged home equity line of credit documents and the digital footprint of the voice-over Internet Protocol number Morgan used to intercept the bank's verification calls. Finally, I outlined Vanguard's fraudulent internal structure, detailing how the inbound capital bypassed restricted holding accounts and funneled directly into executive offshore bonuses. I did not editorialize. I did not use the words sister or parents in the narrative summary. I referred to them as the fraudulent actor and the victims of identity theft. I let the math speak. Numbers are ruthless. They do not require adjectives or dramatic storytelling to prove their point. I reviewed the file one last time, verifying every digit and every timestamp. Then I clicked submit. I closed the laptop, packed my bag, and drove home to make dinner with my husband. David asked how my day was. I told him I handed off a big project and was looking forward to a quiet weekend. I did not feel guilt. I felt the profound, settling calm of someone who had simply handed the truth over to the people equipped to handle it. I went to work the next day and audited a different company. I drank my coffee. I went to the gym. I existed in a state of calm anticipation. I knew the exact velocity of a federal financial investigation once they have the routing numbers handed to them on a silver platter. The government moves slowly when they have to search for the crime. They move like lightning when you give them the map. It took exactly 72 hours. 3 days after I submitted the whistleblower tip, the New York private equity firm formally withdrew their $80 million buyout offer. They did not issue a public explanation. They did not send a polite email detailing their concerns. They simply severed all communication with Seattle, terminating the acquisition permanently. That same afternoon, the Federal Bureau of Investigation executed a coordinated raid on the Belltown headquarters of Vanguard Logistics. I did not have to read about it in the news. The financial sector is a small community, and word travels fast when a high-profile tech firm implodes. Agents walked into the penthouse office space, ordered the executives to step away from their computers, and began seizing servers. They froze the corporate bank accounts. They boxed up the paper files and locked the doors. Morgan was sitting at her desk, enjoying the view of the Space Needle, when the badge-carrying agents entered her office. They did not care about her designer wardrobe or her unearned title. They cared about the wire fraud. They cared about the forged documents. The illusion she had spent her entire adult life cultivating shattered in an instant. The corporate empire was gone. The stolen money was frozen inside a criminal investigation. She was no longer a tech industry prodigy. She was the primary suspect in a multi-million-dollar embezzlement and identity theft ring. But Seattle was only ground zero. The shockwave of the raid was traveling outward, moving across the country at the speed of an automated banking alert. When federal agents freeze corporate accounts, they notify the originating financial institutions to halt any pending transfers. The moment the SEC flagged the Vanguard escrow ledger, a severe risk alert was generated and sent straight to the compliance department of the Suncoast Credit Union in Tampa. My parents had spent 2 months living in quiet ignorance. They assumed their retirement was safe. They assumed the deed to their house was sitting securely in a filing cabinet. They were about to discover that the daughter they worshipped had burned their sanctuary to the ground. The quiet of my honeymoon era was officially over, and my silent phone was about to become the epicenter of their panic. The wheels of federal justice do not turn overnight. When you watch a movie, an anonymous tip usually results in a dramatic arrest by the next morning. Real life operates on a much slower bureaucratic timeline. The Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation require weeks to secure subpoenas, unseal bank records, and map the flow of illicit capital. For 2 months, a strange, suspended quiet settled over my life. November faded into December. The Texas heat gave way to brief cold rains. David and I decorated our first holiday tree together. I continued to go to my office, drink my coffee, and audit legitimate companies. During those same 60 days, my parents lived in a state of manufactured bliss. They returned to Florida from their Seattle trip, carrying souvenirs and hundreds of photographs. They showed off pictures of the yacht to their neighbors. They bragged to the cashier at the grocery store about their brilliant daughter, who had just made partner at a tech firm. They went to sleep every night in a house they believed they owned free and clear, completely unaware that the foundation had already been sold out from under them. The shockwave finally reached Tampa on a Tuesday morning. The mechanism of their ruin was triggered by a routine compliance check. When the federal agents froze the Vanguard Logistics operating accounts in Seattle, the seizure warrants rippled backward through the banking network. The warrants traced every incoming wire transfer to its origin. The moment the federal flag hit the Suncoast Credit Union routing numbers, the local compliance officers were forced to act. A regional bank manager picked up his phone and dialed the primary contact number for Richard Taylor. To understand how hard this phone call hit my father, you have to understand his relationship with that property. He did not just buy that house. He spent 25 years molding it. He spent his weekends in the late 1990s on his hands and knees, installing the oak hardwood floors plank by plank. He built the back deck himself, measuring and cutting the cedar during the humid summer afternoons. That house was his monument. It was his proof that he had worked hard, provided for his family, and secured his retirement. When the bank manager told my father that his accounts were frozen pending a federal fraud investigation, my father laughed. He told the manager there had to be a clerical error. He explained that his mortgage had been paid off for years and his retirement funds were sitting safely in a conservative portfolio. The manager pulled the digital files. He read the details of the $800,000 home equity line of credit. He read the dates of the 401k liquidations. He explained that the money had been wired to an escrow account in Washington state, using a digital signature and a durable power of attorney. My father dropped the phone on the kitchen floor. The illusion shattered in a matter of seconds. He logged into his online banking portal, a system he usually checked with immense pride. The balances stared back at him stark and unforgiving. His retirement account read 0, his savings account read 0. And worst of all, his property profile showed an active delinquent lien. Because the loan had been flagged for identity theft and wire fraud, the bank had instantly initiated pre-foreclosure proceedings to protect their collateral. At the exact same moment, my parents were discovering their financial execution in Florida. Morgan was experiencing her own reality check in Seattle. The golden child did not get a polite phone call. She got a knock on the door of her Belltown penthouse. Federal agents do not care about your social media aesthetic or your designer wardrobe. They handed her a formal indictment. Morgan was charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit embezzlement. The federal government seized her bank accounts, her leased vehicle, and her passport. The corporate prodigy was suddenly facing decades in a federal penitentiary. That is when my phone started ringing. It began at 9 in the morning. I was sitting at my desk in Austin reviewing a spreadsheet for a new client. My phone rested on the edge of the desk. The screen lit up. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. Because I had routed their numbers to a silent profile, the phone did not vibrate or emit a sound. It just glowed. I watched the incoming call screen time out. 10 seconds later, it lit up again. Then came a text message. Then another call. Then a call from my father. By noon on that Tuesday, I had 84 missed calls and 36 text messages. I did not open the messages. I did not listen to the voicemails. I left the phone on the desk and went to lunch with a colleague. I ate a chicken salad, discussed the upcoming quarterly goals for our firm, and enjoyed the crisp winter air. I had spent my entire life absorbing their anxiety. I was no longer available to play the role of the shock absorber. The digital barrage escalated over the next 48 hours. Panic is a powerful motivator. When a toxic family system loses control of a situation, they frantically try to locate the one person who usually fixes their problems. By Thursday evening, I was sitting on my living room sofa with David. The fireplace was burning. I opened my phone and looked at the notification center. The numbers were staggering. 315 missed calls, text messages, and voicemails. The notifications clogged my screen, a desperate digital footprint of a family in freefall. I tapped the voicemail icon and pressed play on the most recent audio file. My mother's voice filled the quiet living room. She was not using her practiced sighing tone. She was breathless, her words tumbling over each other in a high-pitched cadence of pure terror. "Riley, please pick up the phone," she pleaded. The audio clipped as she practically shouted into the receiver. Morgan made a terrible mistake. She got mixed up with some bad people at her new job. The bank here is telling your father they are going to take the house. They took his retirement. It is all gone, Riley. You are a forensic accountant. You know how to talk to these people. You need to call the bank. Tell them it is a misunderstanding. Please, Riley, we are going to be on the street. I let the voicemail end. The automated system moved to the next message. It was my father. His voice was thick, cracking under the weight of a humiliation he could barely articulate. He demanded I call him back. He told me I had a duty to step in and fix the ledger. I sat back against the sofa cushions and stared at the glowing logs in the fireplace. Listen to the phrasing my mother used. Morgan made a terrible mistake. She got mixed up with some bad people. Even while their house was being repossessed, even while facing the total evaporation of their life savings, my mother was still spinning a narrative to protect the golden child. Morgan did not commit federal wire fraud. She just made a mistake. They did not call to ask how my wedding went. They did not call to apologize for missing the most important day of my life. They did not express a single ounce of remorse for abandoning me. They called because the golden child had finally burned their house to the ground, and they expected me to run into the flames with a bucket of water. They wanted to use my CPA credentials, my professional network, and my intellect to untangle a federal crime. They wanted the contingency plan to activate and save the day. I pressed the delete button. I erased the voicemails. I cleared the text messages. I set the phone on the coffee table and turned my attention back to the fire. I had drawn a boundary, and I was going to enforce it. I was not going to negotiate with people who only remembered my phone number when their own actions brought them to ruin. But a family built on entitlement does not accept silence easily. When my parents realized I was not going to answer the phone, they changed their tactics. They realized they could not reach me directly, so they decided to leverage the rest of the family tree. They deputized my aunts, my uncles, and my cousins. They launched a coordinated, aggressive campaign of guilt and harassment, determined to force my compliance from every possible angle. When you refuse to play your assigned role in a dysfunctional family, the system does not gently adapt. It forcefully attempts to pull you back into alignment. My parents realized that calling me directly was yielding zero results. The silence coming from Austin was absolute. They could not manipulate me with panic, and they could not browbeat me with authority. So they pivoted to a classic, highly effective tactic. They deployed the flying monkeys. The flying monkeys are the extended relatives, family friends, and peripheral figures who are recruited by the primary antagonists to do their bidding. They are fed a highly curated, deeply distorted version of the truth. My parents did not tell my aunts and cousins that they had skipped my wedding to attend a cocktail party. They did not admit they had poured their entire net worth into a corporate scam without consulting a financial advisor. Instead, Richard and Diane spun a narrative of victimhood. They painted Morgan as a naive girl caught in a corporate trap, and they painted themselves as helpless retirees facing an unfair eviction. Most importantly, they painted me as the cold, calculating accountant who possessed the power to save the family but cruelly refused to lift a finger. The barrage began on a Saturday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen island drinking coffee and reviewing my personal budget for the month. My phone, still set to route their calls to the silent folder, began populating a steady stream of notifications. My Aunt Claire, my mother's older sister, initiated the offensive. Claire lived in a condominium in Sarasota and viewed herself as the moral compass of the extended family. She rarely spoke to me outside of major holidays, but she felt entirely comfortable dictating my responsibilities. Her text message spanned 3 paragraphs. "Riley, I cannot believe you are abandoning your parents in their hour of need," she wrote. "They are beside themselves with worry. You are a certified financial professional. You navigate the corporate world every day. It is your duty to hire them a defense attorney and speak to the bank on their behalf. Family is the only thing that matters, and your behavior right now is shameful." I read the message, took a sip of coffee, and set the phone down. Family is the only thing that matters. It is a fascinating phrase. People only deploy that phrase when they want you to endure something unacceptable. When my parents were booking first-class tickets to Seattle and ignoring my wedding invitations, family was a very flexible concept. The moment the money ran out, family suddenly became an ironclad, non-negotiable contract. An hour later, the notifications spiked again. This time, the assault came from a different angle. My cousin Mark left a voicemail. Mark was 30 years old, working in retail management in Orlando. He had always idolized Morgan and viewed her aesthetic lifestyle as the pinnacle of success. His tone on the recording was not pleading like my mother's. It was aggressive and entitled. "Riley, you need to step up," Mark said, his voice sharp and demanding. "Morgan is looking at federal time, and your parents are going to lose their house. You and David have good jobs. You do not have kids yet. You need to pull your savings together and pay off that loan to stop the foreclosure. It is what family does. Do not be selfish." I listened to the recording twice, marveling at the sheer audacity. Mark expected me to drain my personal savings, the same savings David and I had used to pay for our own wedding to cover a fraudulent loan stolen by the sister they had consistently chosen over me. In the twisted logic of the Taylor family, my money was family money. My resources, my credit score, and my professional expertise were communal assets to be deployed whenever Morgan made a mess. I was expected to finance their survival, yet my parents' presence at my wedding was treated as an optional luxury they could not afford. The hypocrisy was so dense it was almost suffocating. I did not respond to Claire. I did not text Mark back. I did not attempt to defend myself or explain the forensic reality of the federal investigation. Engaging with flying monkeys is a strategic error. If you argue, you validate their premise. You signal that their opinions matter. Instead, I treated the harassment exactly the way I treated a corporate audit. I documented it coldly and methodically. I opened a secure folder on my laptop. I took screenshots of every text message from Aunt Claire, Uncle Robert, and Cousin Mark. I downloaded the audio files of the voicemails. I archived the time-stamped communications, building a precise digital record of their demands and their abuse. I was not building a case for a court of law. I was building an ironclad boundary for my own peace of mind. I knew exactly what my silence was doing to them. Silence is a mirror. When you refuse to argue, when you refuse to provide them with the fuel of an emotional reaction, they are forced to sit alone with their own actions. They were terrified of what that mirror was showing them. They were projecting their own guilt onto me, trying to make me the villain so they would not have to acknowledge their own complicity in Morgan's ruin. The weekend passed in a digital storm. The notifications kept arriving, each one more frantic and judgmental than the last. By Sunday night, the tone of the messages began to shift. The aggression morphed into desperation. They realized that the guilt trips were failing. The shame tactics were bouncing off an impenetrable wall. When a toxic system realizes they cannot shame you into compliance from a distance, they escalate to physical proximity. They decide that the digital barrier is too easy for you to ignore. My parents had spent their entire lives avoiding accountability. They were not going to let the bank seize their property without forcing a confrontation. They believed that if they could just get me in a room, if they could look me in the eye and weaponize their physical presence, I would fold. I had always folded in the past. But they had no money left for airplane tickets. The first-class flights to Seattle were a luxury of a bygone era. Their credit cards were maxed out and their bank accounts were frozen by the federal government. So Richard and Diane packed a small suitcase, climbed into their 10-year-old sedan, and merged onto the interstate. They left the Florida heat behind and began driving west. They drove for 16 hours straight. They crossed state lines, navigated the sprawling highways of the Deep South, and pushed their exhaustion aside, fueled entirely by a desperate need to reclaim control over the contingency plan. I was sitting in my office on a Friday afternoon finalizing an audit report, completely unaware that the people I had legally erased from my life were currently navigating the traffic on Interstate 35, heading straight for my front door. The digital siege had failed. The physical ambush was about to begin. Friday evenings in Austin usually carry a specific kind of relief. The heavy corporate energy dissipates, the traffic on the interstate thins out, and the city settles into the weekend. I left my office right at 5 o'clock, rolled down my car windows, and let the warm evening air clear my mind. The forensic audit I was working on was proceeding smoothly. The digital boundaries I had established were holding firm. I had not received a single notification from Florida in 48 hours. I assumed my parents had finally accepted defeat. I assumed they were busy consulting bankruptcy attorneys and packing their belongings. I turned onto my street, enjoying the familiar sight of the mature oak trees lining the sidewalks. Our house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It was a modest property, but David and I had spent our first year of marriage making it ours. We painted the trim, planted drought-resistant shrubs, and built a life that felt entirely secure. As I steered my car around the final curve, that sense of security evaporated. A dusty silver sedan was parked haphazardly at the curb in front of my house. The front bumper was covered in highway grime and insect splatters. I recognized the make and model immediately. I recognized the faded dealership sticker on the trunk. Then my headlights swept across the license plate, illuminating the orange and green citrus emblem of the state of Florida. I hit the brakes. The car jerked to a sudden stop at the edge of my driveway. My parents had breached the perimeter. The digital wall had successfully blocked their calls, so they had weaponized their physical bodies. They had driven 1,000 miles, crossing 5 state lines, existing on gas station coffee, and sheer desperation just to corner me on my own property. I put the car in park and turned off the engine. I did not immediately open the door. I took a slow, deep breath, watching the scene unfold through the windshield. Richard and Diane were sitting on the brick steps of my front porch. They did not look like the triumphant, wealthy executives who had raised crystal flutes of champagne on a Seattle yacht. The corporate illusion had been stripped away. My mother looked hollow. She was wearing wrinkled linen trousers and a faded sweater. Her hair, which had been professionally styled for Morgan's induction gala, was pulled back into a messy, uneven knot. She sat with her knees pulled together, her hands gripping the straps of her purse like a life preserver. My father looked broken, but the kind of broken that still desperately clings to arrogance. He was leaning against the wooden railing wearing a stained polo shirt. His face was gray-lined with the severe exhaustion that comes from driving 16 hours straight. The bank had seized his retirement and initiated foreclosure on his sanctuary. He was a man who had lost his entire identity, yet he was currently trespassing on my lawn, preparing to demand my obedience. I opened my car door and stepped onto the driveway. The sound of the car door shutting echoed in the quiet neighborhood. My parents' heads snapped up. They scrambled to their feet. At that exact moment, the front door of my house opened. David stepped out onto the porch. He had been working from home that afternoon. He did not say a word to my parents. He simply walked down the brick steps, bypassed them entirely, and came to stand directly behind my right shoulder. His presence was a silent, immovable fortress. My mother closed the distance between us, her shoes shuffling against the concrete. She did not say hello. She did not ask how I was doing. She immediately deployed the weapon she thought would break me. Riley, my mother sobbed, her voice cracking as tears spilled over her eyelashes. We lost everything. She reached out, trying to grab my forearms. I took one deliberate step backward, placing myself out of her physical reach. Her hands dropped to her sides. The bank is taking the house. She continued, her breathing rapid and shallow. The accounts are frozen. Morgan is in terrible trouble with the federal government. We drove all night because you would not answer the phone. You have to help us. You and David have a dual income. You have savings. You have to give us the money to stop the foreclosure proceedings. I stood perfectly still on the concrete driveway. I looked at the woman who had birthed me. I listened to the sheer audacity of her request. She was asking me to liquidate my own financial security to pay off a fraudulent lien initiated by the sister they had consistently chosen over me. When my mother realized her tears were failing to produce a reaction, she faltered. She looked back at my father, silently begging him to intervene. My father stepped forward. He tried to straighten his spine. He puffed out his chest, attempting to summon the patriarchal authority he used to wield so effectively in our childhood home. He wanted to project strength, but his hands were trembling. "You are going to fix this," my father said. His voice was rough, scraping against the evening air. "You are an accountant. You know how these banking regulations work. You are going to call the credit union on Monday morning, and you are going to wire the funds to clear the delinquency. We are your parents. You have a moral obligation to help this family survive." I studied his face. I studied the rigid set of his jaw and the desperate entitlement burning in his eyes. A moral obligation. I let the phrase hang in the air between us. I thought about the moral obligation of attending a daughter's wedding. I thought about the moral obligation of honesty, of fairness, of protecting your children equally. They had abandoned all of those obligations decades ago. They had spent their entire lives investing their emotional and financial capital into Morgan, assuming the golden child would eventually pay dividends. Now the investment had gone bankrupt. The yacht had sunk, and they expected the contingency plan to absorb the total loss. They were standing on the property that David and I had purchased with our own labor. They were demanding access to the bank accounts we had built without a single dime of their assistance. In their minds, my success was merely a communal asset waiting to be deployed for their convenience. My life only possessed value when it could be leveraged for their survival. "You drove a very long way," I said. My voice was entirely flat. It carried no anger, no pity, and no warmth. It was the clinical tone of an auditor reading a final balance sheet. "We did not have a choice," my mother cried, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "We are destitute, Riley. The government took everything." "They did not take anything," I replied. "Morgan stole it. And you enabled her." My father took another step toward me, his face flushing dark red. "Do not speak about your sister that way," he growled. "She made an error in judgment. She was misled by those corporate executives. She is family. We protect family." The delusion was impenetrable. Even standing on the precipice of homelessness, he was still protecting Morgan's image. He was still willing to bankrupt me to shield the golden child from accountability. I looked at the two people who had abandoned me on the most important day of my life. I had spent 32 years waiting for them to see me. I had spent 32 years hoping they would eventually realize my worth. Standing in the driveway, bathed in the fading Texas sunlight, the final remnants of that hope vanished. I realized I did not want their approval anymore. I just wanted them off my property. They wanted an explanation. They wanted a reason why I was refusing to play the role of the savior. They thought they had cornered me, trapping me with their physical presence and their demands for familial loyalty. They did not know that I possessed the ultimate receipt. They did not know that the forensic accountant they were currently trying to bully was the exact same whistleblower who had triggered the federal raid that ruined them. I reached into the leather work bag slung over my shoulder. The time for silence had ended. It was time to show them the mirror, and the reflection was going to be devastating. The driveway was bathed in the warm, fading light of the Texas evening. My father stood with his shoulders squared, waiting for my compliance. He watched my hand disappear into my leather work bag. I knew exactly what he expected me to pull out. He expected me to produce a checkbook. He thought I was going to ask for the routing numbers to the Florida Credit Union and initiate a wire transfer to cure the delinquency on his mortgage. He believed his patriarchal posturing had worked. I did not pull out a checkbook. I did not pull out my phone to call a defense attorney. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy stock printer paper. I had prepared this document weeks ago, anticipating the exact moment the federal reality would force them to my doorstep. I unfolded the paper and held it out. My father hesitated. He looked at the sheet, then looked at my face, confused by the pivot. He reached out and took the paper from my fingers. My mother shuffled closer to him, peering over his shoulder to see what I had handed him. It was a high-resolution color printout of an Instagram post. The image was crisp. It captured my mother wearing her custom navy evening gown, leaning in to kiss Morgan on the cheek. It captured my father standing on the teak deck of the chartered yacht, holding a crystal flute of champagne high in the air. The Seattle skyline loomed in the background. Printed clearly at the bottom of the page was the digital timestamp of the live broadcast. October 16th, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was the exact hour I was standing in a bridal suite in Texas, pinning a white veil into my hair, preparing to walk past an empty row of mahogany chairs. My father stared at the printed photograph. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. His hand began to tremble, causing the heavy paper to shake. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The defense he had prepared, the lectures about familial duty, evaporated the moment he realized I possessed the receipt of his betrayal. My mother let out a sharp, shallow gasp. She brought a hand up to cover her mouth, her eyes darting from the photograph to my face. "You knew," my mother whispered. Her voice was thin and hollow. "You knew where we were." I kept my voice soft. I did not need volume to deliver the final blow. "You drove 3,000 miles to celebrate a lie that ruined you," I said. I looked directly into my father's eyes. "You found the cash for first-class tickets. You found the money for penthouse rentals and bespoke suits. You crossed 4 time zones to toast a corporate title your favorite daughter bought with your stolen retirement funds. But you could not cross 2 states to watch me get married." My father swallowed hard. The paper crinkled in his grip. "Riley," he started, his voice cracking. We thought she had earned it. We wanted to support her success. We did not know she took the money. I did not let him finish the excuse. It does not matter what you thought she earned, I said, cutting him off with clinical precision. You made your choice on that yacht. You allocated your time, your money, and your affection to Morgan. You chose your priority. Now you get to live with the bill. My mother stepped forward, her tears returning with a new frantic energy. But you can fix this, she pleaded, her voice rising in pitch. You are an auditor. You know how the federal government tracks these things. You can talk to the investigators. You can explain that Morgan did not mean to hurt us. You can clear her name so she can pay the bank back. The delusion was staggering. She still believed Morgan was capable of generating $1.5 million. She still believed the system could be manipulated if she just threw the right daughter at the problem. I looked at my mother. It was time to show them the entire board. It was time to reveal the true architecture of their collapse. Morgan cannot pay the bank back, Mom. The money is gone. It was fed into a corporate Ponzi scheme that no longer exists. My father frowned, his brow furrowing. How do you know that, he asked, his voice dropping to a confused whisper. The credit union manager did not know anything about a Ponzi scheme. The federal agents in Seattle have not released those details to the public yet. How do you know where the money went? I let the question hang in the warm evening air for 3 seconds. David shifted his weight behind me, a silent sentry watching the destruction unfold. Because I am the forensic auditor assigned to the Vanguard Logistics acquisition, I replied. The words landed like physical strikes. My father took a stumbling step backward. His heel caught the edge of the brick pathway. He caught his balance, but his posture crumpled. I reviewed the escrow ledgers. I continued keeping my delivery even and relentless. I saw the 3 wire transfers originating from your Florida credit union. I pulled the property records for your house. I saw the home equity line of credit Morgan initiated using the outdated medical power of attorney. I saw the telecom routing logs showing how she ported your landline to her Seattle cell phone to intercept the bank verification calls. I saw every single forged signature. My mother let out a low, guttural wail. She grabbed my father's arm, her knees buckling slightly. He did not comfort her. He was staring at me as if I had suddenly morphed into a stranger. You audited your own sister, my father said, the horror bleeding into his tone. You investigated your own family. You could have called us. You could have warned us before the bank froze the accounts. Why did you not call me Riley? I did not audit my sister, I corrected him. I recognized the familial conflict of interest immediately. I recused myself from the corporate buyout to protect my certified public accountant license. I paused, letting the distinction settle in his mind. Then I delivered the final piece of the puzzle. But before I handed the file back to my firm, I packaged the escrow ledgers, the forged loan documents, and the intercepted telecom data. I uploaded the entire dossier to the Securities and Exchange Commission portal. My father stopped breathing. His eyes widened, searching my face for any sign of a joke. I filed the federal whistleblower report, I said. I submitted the tip under SEC Rule 21F. I am the reason the private equity firm terminated the $80 million buyout. I am the reason the Federal Bureau of Investigation raided Morgan's office. The silence that fell over the driveway was profound. The evening breeze rustled the oak leaves above our heads. A neighbor's dog barked in the distance. The reality of the situation locked into place. The daughter they had ignored, the contingency plan they had dismissed, was the architect of their final ruin. You turned your own sister into the federal government, my mother choked out, her face twisted in a mask of pure grief and betrayal. You destroyed her life. You destroyed our house. I did not steal your money, I replied, my voice hard and unyielding. Morgan destroyed your house. Morgan committed federal wire fraud. Morgan committed identity theft against her own parents. I did not forge a single document. I just turned on the light so the federal investigators could see the crime. My father looked at the printed Instagram photo still clutched in his trembling hand. He looked at his own smiling face captured forever in the act of celebrating the daughter who robbed him. He realized in that moment that he possessed zero leverage. The guilt trips were useless. The demands for familial loyalty were dead on arrival. He was standing in front of the federal whistleblower who held the keys to the prosecution. "You are cold," my father whispered, staring at me with a mixture of fear and disgust. "You are a cold, unforgiving person, Riley." I smiled. It was a small, tight smile that did not reach my eyes. "I am a forensic accountant," I said. "I just balanced the ledger." I turned my body, indicating the property line behind them. "Now get off my property," I commanded. "Do not call my phone again. Do not drive to my house. If you contact me or my husband, I will file a restraining order, and I will hand the documentation of your harassment directly to the federal prosecutor handling Morgan's case." David took a deliberate step forward, moving from behind my shoulder to stand beside me. He crossed his arms over his chest. He did not say a word, but the physical threat was clear. The negotiation was over. Richard and Diane had nothing left to say. The patriarchal authority was shattered. The maternal guilt trips were incinerated. They turned around, their shoulders slumped, and walked slowly toward their dusty silver sedan. My father opened the passenger door for my mother. She climbed inside, hiding her face in her hands. He walked around to the driver's side, got in, and started the engine. The car idled for a moment, the exhaust coughing into the evening air. Then he put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. I watched the taillights disappear around the corner of the cul-de-sac. They were gone. The physical ambush had failed, just like the digital siege before it. I had deployed the ultimate receipt, and it had severed the final tether holding us together. The driveway was empty. The air smelled like jasmine and warm asphalt. I turned around and walked back into my house with my husband. The conflict was over, but the fallout from that driveway confrontation would echo through the federal court system for the next 2 years, bringing the story to a permanent and irreversible conclusion. The federal justice system does not care about family ledgers. It operates like a blind machine, processing evidence, executing warrants, and reclaiming stolen capital with a cold and unforgiving precision. When the Florida Credit Union finalized their internal audit, they did not offer my parents a grace period. Financial institutions do not negotiate with victims of identity theft when the collateral is already compromised. They simply move to protect their own ledgers. Exactly 30 days after my parents drove away from my house in Texas, the final foreclosure notice was posted on the front door of their Tampa property. The physical eviction was quiet, but the humiliation was public. The county sheriff arrived at their gated community on a Tuesday morning. He parked his cruiser in the driveway, walked up the brick steps, and stood by while a locksmith changed the deadbolts. The neighbors, the same people my parents had bragged to about their brilliant executive daughter, watched from their manicured lawns as Richard and Diane carried cardboard boxes out to their car. My father lost his monument. The house he had spent decades paying off, the hardwood floors he had installed by hand, the cedar deck in the backyard. All of it was seized to satisfy the fraudulent lien Morgan had placed against the deed. Their financial ruin did not stop at the property line. The Internal Revenue Service assessed the early withdrawal of my father's retirement accounts. Because the funds were liquidated before the legal age limit, severe tax liabilities were triggered. The government absorbed whatever residual cash remained to cover the penalties. Today, my parents live in a cramped one-bedroom apartment located just off a major interstate highway. The environment is a stark contrast to the quiet, gated sanctuary they used to inhabit. The windows of their rental unit rattle every time a commercial transport truck shifts gears on the highway outside. The air smells of diesel exhaust and hot concrete. They have no pension, no mutual funds, and no savings. They survive strictly on the modest Social Security checks deposited into their account on the first of every month. The funds are barely enough to cover their rent and utilities, leaving a grocery budget that requires constant stressful calculation. The social isolation surrounding them is even more profound than their financial poverty. The flying monkeys who had bombarded my phone with demands and guilt trips vanished the moment the federal indictments became public record. Toxic systems only revere power status and the illusion of wealth. Once those elements are stripped away, the loyalists scatter. Aunt Claire stopped sending text messages about the importance of family. Cousin Mark stopped leaving voicemails about moral obligations. My parents were left entirely alone in their highway apartment, abandoned by the same extended relatives they had tried to weaponize against me. They are living a solitary existence, forced to wake up every morning and look at the direct result of their own conditional love. While my parents navigate the consequences of enabling the golden child is navigating the reality of the federal penal system. Morgan did not take her case to trial. Federal prosecutors possess an overwhelming conviction rate. When they presented her defense attorney with the digital dossier, I had compiled the forged loan documents, the intercepted telecom logs, and the traced wire transfers. Her legal strategy collapsed. She could not charm a federal judge the way she charmed my parents. She could not cry her way out of an identity theft charge. She accepted a formal plea agreement to avoid a longer sentence. Morgan pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud in the United States District Court in Seattle. The judge ordered her to serve 48 months in federal custody. She was remanded to the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California. It is a low-security facility, but it is still a cage. Her days of manipulating narratives and projecting an aesthetic of wealth are over. There is no polished teak deck to walk on. There are no waiters carrying silver trays of oysters. She does not wear emerald sequins or designer heels. She wears standard-issue khaki clothing and sleeps on a narrow institutional mattress. She has no European sedan and no luxury high-rise apartment. Most importantly, she has no golden child status left. The corporate title she stole her parents' future to buy is now a permanent felony record that will follow her for the rest of her life. The architects of Vanguard Logistics met a similar fate. The founders who orchestrated the pay-to-play scheme were indicted on multiple counts of securities fraud and conspiracy. The $80 million buyout they had desperately tried to secure was officially dead buried under mountains of federal subpoenas. The corporate illusion they built was dismantled piece by piece. In Austin, the air is much cleaner. David and I just celebrated our first wedding anniversary. We did not throw a lavish party or rent a yacht. We stayed home, cooked a quiet dinner together, and sat on the back porch listening to the wind move through the oak trees. There was no drama. There were no frantic phone calls demanding money. There was only peace, a steady and enduring calm that comes from knowing the foundation of your life is built on truth. The guest bedroom down the hall is currently covered in drop cloths and blue painter's tape. David spent the weekend assembling a wooden crib, while I painted the walls a soft, warm yellow. We are expecting a baby girl in the spring. When I sit in that room and look at the empty crib, I think about the legacy I am leaving behind. I think about the invisible ledger that governed my childhood, the constant, exhausting calculation of worth based on obedience and submission. I am breaking that ledger in half. My daughter will grow up in a home where love is a baseline, not a transaction. She will never have to earn her place at our dining table. She will never be asked to fund someone else's delusions or shrink her own life to accommodate a toxic hierarchy. She will be taught the value of a boundary. She will learn that she has the right to walk away from people who hurt her, even if those people share her last name. Society conditions us to accept abuse simply because it comes from a relative. We are told to forgive the unforgivable because family is supposed to be permanent. But I have learned a very different truth through the lens of a corporate audit and the silence of my own phone. Blood is nothing but a biological accident. It is a random roll of the genetic dice. It does not carry a mandatory obligation of suffering. Loyalty is a behavioral choice. It is earned through consistent, respectful actions. It is built by showing up, by telling the truth, and by treating the people around you with basic human dignity. My family chose to invest their loyalty in a comfortable lie, and that lie bankrupted them. I chose to invest my loyalty in myself and the man who stood beside me, and that choice set me free. I am Riley Taylor. I stayed silent. I did my job, and I let the truth bury them. I often sit on the back porch of our Austin home just as the Texas heat softens into a cool evening breeze. Inside, David is humming a quiet tune while putting the finishing touches on our daughter's nursery. For 32 years, I thought peace meant avoiding an argument with my parents. Now I know true peace is the absence of their invisible ledger. Looking back at the empty mahogany chairs, the forged loan documents, and the desperate voicemails, I realized that the collapse of my family was not just a tragedy, it was a profound education. When you survive a toxic ecosystem, you leave with a harsh, unshakable clarity. I walked away from the wreckage with three absolute truths. First, silence is the ultimate boundary. We are conditioned to believe we must explain our pain and demand apologies. But anger just proves you are still tethered to their game. True power lies in apathy. I didn't have to scream or argue to defeat them. I just had to let the phone ring. Second, love is an action, not a transaction. People will easily lie with their words, but they will never lie with their resources. My parents claimed poverty to skip my wedding, but magically found nearly $10,000 for a cocktail party. The math will always show you exactly what you are worth to them. Finally, biology is not a binding contract. Sharing genetics is just a biological accident, but loyalty, respect, and devotion are behavioral choices. You have the absolute right to walk away from people who hurt you, even if they share your last name and curate a family that actually chooses you. Thank you for spending your time with me today. If my journey resonated with you, or if you have had to enforce a quiet boundary of your own, please leave a comment below and share your experience. Hit the subscribe button so you never miss an update. This is Hazel Tells Stories, reminding you that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. See you in the next one.